Trump just said something that stopped the entire country in its tracks. And if you're paying $5 for gas right now, you need to hear this. Standing right outside the White House, President Donald Trump looked directly at the American people and told them that the pain they're feeling at the pump, the $4.53, the $4.89, the nearly $5 a gallon prices that are draining wallets from New Jersey to Nevada, is, in his words, peanuts. Not a mistake, not a slip. A deliberate, calculated statement from a sitting president who says he knew exactly what he was doing when he made the decision that triggered all of this. And here's the thing. Once you understand what's actually behind those gas prices, once you understand what's really at stake on the other side of this equation, the conversation changes completely. Because this isn't just about what you're paying at the pump. This is about something far bigger, something that, if it goes wrong, changes the world forever. Let's break this down from the very beginning, because most people are only seeing the headline and missing the full picture. Go back to February 28th of this year. That's the date that changed everything. The United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes against Iran, the opening shots of what has now become a full-scale military confrontation with one of the most strategically dangerous nations on the planet. Since that day, gas prices in America have climbed by 50%. 50%. Think about what that means in real terms. If you were paying $3 at the pump before, you're now paying $4.50. If you were paying $3.50, you're pushing $5.25. Every trip to the grocery store costs more. Every commute costs more. Every delivery, every flight, every product that moves through a supply chain powered by fuel, it all costs more. The average American family is feeling this in a very real, very tangible way, and they want answers. So when Trump steps in front of reporters and says it's peanuts, you can understand why that lands like a punch to the gut for a lot of people. But here's what's really happening beneath that headline. And this is the part that most people missed. The reason gas prices are this high isn't random. It isn't just inflation. It isn't just market forces. It comes down to one specific choke point on the global map that you need to understand, because it explains almost everything. It's called the Strait of Hormuz. If you're not familiar with it, here's what you need to know. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway, less than 30 miles wide at its narrowest point, that sits between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. And through that tiny stretch of ocean flows approximately 20% of the entire world's oil supply. 1 in 5 barrels of oil that power the global economy passes through the Strait of Hormuz. That's not a minor detail. That's an almost incomprehensible amount of leverage sitting in one geographic location. And Iran knows it. Iran has known it for decades. When the conflict escalated, Iran effectively shut down traffic through the strait. Ships stopped moving. Oil tankers couldn't pass safely. And the moment that happened, the global oil market reacted the way markets always react to sudden supply shocks. Prices spiked, and they spiked fast. That's the direct chain of events that leads to what you're seeing on gas station signs right now. This is not abstract economics. This is cause and effect playing out in real time, and American consumers are absorbing the impact every single day. Now here's where Trump's argument gets interesting, because he's not hiding from any of this. He's not pretending the consequences aren't real. In fact, he said something on Tuesday that was remarkably candid for any president to say out loud. He told reporters that before making the decision to go into this confrontation with Iran, he looked at the economic projections and thought the stock market would drop by 25%. 25%. That's a crash-level number. That's the kind of drop that wipes out retirement accounts, shakes business confidence, and dominates every financial news cycle for months. And Trump says he looked at that number, and he was okay with it. His words, not ours. I was okay with that to get rid of a nuclear potential holocaust. Read that again. A sitting American president said he was willing to accept a 25% market crash as a cost worth paying. That's either one of the most reckless statements ever made from the White House lawn, or it's one of the most honest assessments of a genuine existential threat that any leader has publicly acknowledged. And depending on where you stand, you're probably landing hard on one side of that line. But before you decide, let's keep going. Because the next part of the story is where the real tension lives. Why does Iran getting a nuclear weapon matter so much? Why does Trump, and frankly, why do foreign policy analysts across the political spectrum, including many who are deeply critical of Trump on nearly everything else, treat this as such a non-negotiable red line? Here's the reality that gets lost when this debate turns into a partisan shouting match. Iran is not a passive actor on the global stage. This is a country whose government has, for decades, openly funded and armed proxy military forces across the Middle East. In Lebanon, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria. Hezbollah, one of the most heavily armed non-state military organizations in the world, receives significant support from Tehran. The Houthis, in Yemen, who spent years launching drone and missile attacks on commercial shipping and on Saudi Arabia, operate with Iranian backing. Iran's foreign policy, at its core, has been built around the concept of projecting power and destabilizing adversaries through these networks. That's not a conspiracy theory. It's documented. It's been documented for years, and it's something that U.S. intelligence agencies across multiple administrations have consistently confirmed. Now take that same government, with that same ideology, those same alliances, that same history of funding armed groups, and give them a nuclear weapon. What changes? Everything. The entire calculus of deterrence in the Middle East changes overnight. Every neighboring country, from Saudi Arabia to the United Arab Emirates to Jordan to Egypt, has to make new calculations about their own security. The question of whether Saudi Arabia begins its own nuclear program becomes urgent and immediate. The possibility of a regional nuclear arms race, multiple countries racing to develop or acquire their own weapons as a hedge against a nuclear-armed Iran, becomes a serious and frightening scenario. And that's before you even factor in the question of what a nuclear-armed Iran does to its willingness to support and arm its proxy networks. Because right now, there are limits to how aggressive those proxy groups can be. A nuclear umbrella changes those limits. This is the argument that Trump is making, and it's an argument that has serious strategic logic behind it, even if you deeply disagree with how he's chosen to pursue it. The question isn't whether Iran with nuclear weapons would be dangerous. Nearly every serious analyst agrees it would be. The question, the real debate, is whether this is the right way to stop it, and whether the cost is worth it. And that cost is very real. Let's not gloss over it. Gas at $4.53 a gallon nationally, and climbing. In some parts of the country, particularly in states with additional taxes or distribution challenges, prices are pushing even higher. A Sunoco station in Paramus, New Jersey was photographed this week showing regular gas at $4.89 for cash and $4.99 for credit. $5 a gallon for regular. These aren't small numbers for working families. For someone with a long commute, someone who drives a truck for work, someone who lives in a rural area with no public transit options, this is a serious material hit to their monthly budget. The economic ripple effects extend far beyond the gas station. Food prices go up because transportation costs go up. Small businesses with delivery operations face squeezed margins. Airlines pass fuel costs onto ticket prices. Everything connected to the movement of goods and people gets more expensive, and the burden of that falls disproportionately on people who are already stretched thin. Trump acknowledged all of this on Tuesday. He didn't pretend it isn't happening. He asked Americans to put up with it for a little while and said, "It won't be much longer." Those are the kinds of reassurances that are easy to say from the White House and much harder to live with when you're deciding whether you can afford to fill your tank. But what Trump is betting on, and this is the core of his position, is that the American people will accept short-term economic pain if they believe the long-term objective is legitimate and achievable. But here's what's really happening on the diplomatic front right now. And this is where things get serious. The latest round of peace talks between the United States and Iran has stalled. Not collapsed entirely, but stalled, which in diplomatic language can mean many different things, none of them particularly encouraging. Trump has been pushing Tehran to come to the table seriously, to engage in negotiations with real substance, to make commitments that are verifiable and meaningful. And so far, from Trump's perspective at least, that hasn't happened. He's been warning Iran repeatedly and publicly that if they don't get serious about negotiating, the military conflict will restart, that this isn't over, that the pause in active strikes is conditional on progress being made. On Tuesday, Trump went further than a warning. He revealed that just that morning he had been, in his words, only an hour away from launching fresh attacks on Iran. An hour away. Think about what that means. That means somewhere in the chain of military and executive decision-making, a strike package was prepared, was ready, was on the table, and then something shifted. Maybe intelligence came in. Maybe a diplomatic signal arrived. Maybe Trump himself pulled back. But whatever happened, the United States was 1 hour away from escalating a military confrontation that already has global economic consequences, and the president mentioned it almost in passing to reporters outside the White House. "We may have to give them another big hit," Trump said. "I'm not sure yet. You'll know very soon." That's not a throwaway line. That's a sitting president telling the world that he is actively weighing another round of military strikes against a country that controls a choke point for 20% of global oil supply, at a moment when gas prices are already at $4.53 and climbing. Whatever you think of Trump's strategy, whatever your politics, whatever side of this debate you're on, that sentence carries enormous weight. "You'll know very soon" is not diplomatic boilerplate. It's a man who makes decisions fast, who acts on his instincts, and who has shown throughout this situation that he is willing to accept consequences that most politicians would never touch. Now let's zoom out for a moment, because there's a bigger picture here that doesn't get enough attention in the daily cycle of gas prices and diplomatic updates. The Iran nuclear question is not new. It has been at the center of American foreign policy debate for more than 2 decades. The Obama administration negotiated the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, in 2015, which placed restrictions on Iran's nuclear program in exchange for lifting many of the sanctions that had been crushing the Iranian economy. It was a landmark agreement, and its defenders argued it was the best realistic option for keeping Iran from crossing the nuclear threshold. Its critics, including Trump, argued that it didn't go far enough, that it left too many pathways open, and that the sunset clauses meant it was only a delay, not a solution. Trump withdrew from that deal in 2018. Iran, over the subsequent years, accelerated elements of its nuclear program. By the time this confrontation began, Iran was assessed to be alarmingly close to weapons-grade enrichment capacity, weeks away, according to some intelligence estimates. Not years, weeks. That context matters enormously when you're trying to understand why Trump is framing this the way he is. This isn't a situation where the threat is theoretical and distant. The people advising the president, and the intelligence community that briefs him, have been telling him that the window for stopping Iran from crossing the nuclear threshold without a military option is closing. That is a genuinely terrifying assessment. And it's one that has bipartisan roots, because the concern about Iran's nuclear program has never been a Republican-only issue. Democratic presidents have also treated it as a red line. The difference is in the approach, the tools, and the willingness to absorb economic and geopolitical costs. Here's what's also true. This moment is testing something fundamental about the American public's relationship with their government, and specifically with a president who has built his entire brand on economic strength and prosperity. America first, low gas prices, booming markets, energy dominance. These were core pillars of the Trump political identity. His supporters rallied around the idea that under Trump, things would be affordable, that American economic strength would be restored and protected. And now those same supporters are looking at $5 gas and being asked to trust that the trade-off is worth it. That's a significant ask. Not an unreasonable one, given the stakes as Trump describes them, but significant. And the political durability of that ask depends entirely on whether the situation resolves in a way that people can look back on and say, yes, it was worth it. If Iran comes to the table, if a credible deal is struck that genuinely and verifiably ends the threat of an Iranian nuclear weapon, if gas prices come back down and the Strait of Hormuz reopens to normal traffic, then Trump can make a powerful argument that he made a hard call and it paid off. That's the best case outcome he's betting on. That's what "it won't be much longer" is pointing toward. But if the conflict escalates further, if those fresh strikes happen, if Iran responds in ways that further disrupt oil supply, if prices continue climbing, if the economic pain deepens without a clear end in sight, then the political and economic consequences for the administration become severe. The American public has historically been willing to absorb economic hardship in the context of a clear, understood national security objective. But patience isn't infinite, and the gap between peanuts and $5 a gallon reality is one that millions of Americans are experiencing every single day. There's one more dimension to this story that deserves attention because it speaks to the global stakes in a way that goes beyond American politics. What happens to the rest of the world if Iran gets a nuclear weapon? The United States has the economic and military capacity to absorb and adapt to enormous disruptions. Other countries do not. A prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz doesn't just hit American gas prices, it hits every country in Asia that depends on Middle Eastern oil imports. Japan, South Korea, India, China, all of them are deeply dependent on oil that flows through the strait. A nuclear-armed Iran, sitting astride the most important energy choke point on Earth, would have leverage over the global economy that no single nation should have. The implications for energy security, for geopolitical stability, for the balance of power in the most volatile region on Earth, they are not small, they are generational. Trump's line, "You want to see the world exploded?" is dramatic, but it's pointing at something real. A nuclear-armed Iran is not just an American problem, it is a global one. None of this makes the gas prices easier to pay. None of it makes the economic disruption less real for families who are already stretched. And none of it resolves the very legitimate debate about whether this approach, military confrontation rather than sustained diplomacy, is the right one, or whether it will ultimately succeed. Those are genuinely hard questions, and reasonable people disagree on the answers. But here's the takeaway that cuts through all of it. We are living through a moment where the President of the United States is openly telling the American people, "I knew this would hurt, I accepted that it would hurt, and I believe the alternative is worse." That's a rare level of candor from any political leader. It doesn't mean he's right, it doesn't mean the cost is justified, but it does mean that the conversation the country needs to be having right now isn't just about gas prices. It's about what kind of world we want to live in 10 years from now, 20 years from now, when the decisions being made today have fully played out. Trump said Americans won't have to put up with it for much longer. He said Iran will not get a nuclear weapon. He said the world will not be exploded. Those are enormous promises being made against an enormous backdrop of economic pain and geopolitical uncertainty. So the question worth sitting with, the one that doesn't have an easy answer, is this. If it turns out that stopping Iran from going nuclear required exactly the kind of short-term sacrifice that's playing out right now, will the outcome justify the cost? And if it doesn't work, if the strikes restart, if the prices keep rising, if the talks remain stalled, what then? That's the question hanging over every gas station in America right now, and we'll all find out the answer very soon.